The morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, casting long, sharp shadows across the polished marble. Elena adjusted the collar of her light blue cleaner's uniform, the fabric stiff and smelling faintly of industrial lavender. She moved with a practiced, quiet efficiency, her sneakers making no sound against the cold stone. This was her first week at the residence of Mr. Kong, a man whose name was spoken in hushed, terrified tones across the city, yet to Elena, he was merely a ghost who inhabited the upper floors. The air in the mansion felt heavy, thick with the scent of expensive cedar and something metallic, like the edge of a blade. As she polished the mahogany console in the grand hallway, her eyes drifted to the gallery wall, a collection of austere frames containing images of a life she couldn't begin to imagine. Most were landscapes or abstract ink wash paintings, but one frame sat slightly lower than the rest, tucked into a corner near the study door. It was a small, sepia-toned photograph of a young boy sitting on a wooden bench, his eyes wide and hauntingly dark, his hands folded neatly in his lap. Elena stopped. The cloth in her hand went still. She leaned in, her breath hitching as she traced the familiar curve of the boy's jaw and the specific, jagged scar just above his left eyebrow. It was a face she had seen every day for 3 years of her childhood, a face that had shared crusts of bread and whispered promises of escape in the dark. She didn't hear the heavy footsteps behind her or the way the air seemed to chill as a presence filled the doorway. She was back in the damp, gray corridors of the St. Jude Home for Children, smelling the rain on the concrete. The boy in the photo wasn't a titan of industry or a shadow ruler of the underworld. He was just the boy who had protected her from the older kids when the matrons weren't looking. She felt a strange, surging warmth in her chest, a flicker of recognition that bypassed her common sense. She didn't realize who was standing behind her, watching her with eyes as cold as flint. She only saw the boy who had once promised they would never be alone again. The silence was broken by a voice that sounded like grinding stones, low and dangerously calm. "What are you doing?" Elena jumped, spinning around so quickly she nearly knocked over a crystal vase. Standing before her was Mr. Kong. He was taller than he appeared in the news, dressed in a charcoal suit that seemed to absorb the light around him. His expression was a mask of indifference, but his eyes were sharp, scanning her face for any sign of deception or threat. Elena clutched her cleaning cloth to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "I'm sorry, sir," she stammered, her voice small but clear. I was looking at the photo. I didn't mean to linger." She looked back at the small frame, then back at the man who held the city in his grip. A strange boldness took hold of her, born from a memory she hadn't touched in nearly 2 decades. "Sir, this boy," she said, gesturing toward the picture with a trembling hand. "I know him. We grew up together. He lived with me in the orphanage back in the city. He was my best friend." Kang's face didn't move, but something shifted in the depths of his pupils, a flicker of something ancient and raw. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, the scent of his cologne mixing with the sharp tang of her cleaning chemicals. "You are mistaken," he said, the words clipped and final. "That photo is a private heirloom. You will return to your duties and refrain from looking at things that do not concern you." But Elena couldn't stop. "The scar," she whispered, pointing to her own brow. "He got that falling from the oak tree behind the chapel. He was trying to get a kite down for me." His name was Minho then. At the mention of the name, Kang's face went deathly pale, the blood draining from his skin until he looked like a statue carved from salt. The hand he had resting on the doorframe tightened until his knuckles turned white. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, seeing the woman in the blue uniform not as a servant, but as a ghost from a life he had buried under mountains of steel and blood. The air in the hallway became suffocatingly tense, the kind of silence that precedes a violent storm. Kong didn't speak for a long minute, his gaze locked on Elena's face, as if he were trying to find the little girl beneath the tired eyes of a working woman. "You shouldn't know that name," he finally said, his voice a mere shadow of its former authority. It was no longer a command. It was a confession. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. the realization of who she was speaking to finally beginning to settle in her mind. She had heard the stories of the man who ran the docks, the man who had eliminated his rivals without a second thought, but all she saw was the boy who used to share his mittens with her when the heaters failed in the winter. "Minho?" she asked, her voice cracking. "It really is you." Kong turned away abruptly, his back a rigid wall of expensive wool. "Leave us," he barked, but he wasn't looking at her. From the shadows of the hallway, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Marcus appeared. Marcus was Kang's most trusted aide, a man who moved with the lethal grace of a predator. He looked between the two of them, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Sir?" Marcus asked, his hand instinctively moving toward his jacket. "I said leave," Kong repeated, his voice rising with an edge of desperation Elena had never expected to hear. "I will deal with this," Marcus hesitated, his eyes lingering on Elena with a protective, suspicious glint, before he bowed slightly and retreated into the shadows of the foyer. Elena stood frozen, her hands shaking. She wanted to run, to flee back to the safety of her small apartment and forget she had ever seen the photo, but the look on Kang's face held her there. It was a look of profound, agonizing vulnerability. He turned back to her, his features twisted in a mask of suppressed grief. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Out of all the houses in the city, why did you walk into mine?" Elena took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself against the weight of his gaze. "I needed the work," she said simply. "I didn't know it was you. I didn't even know your last name was Kong. To me, you were just the boy who left one night and never came back. I thought you were dead." Everyone said the adoption was a lie, that they just took the older kids to work in the factories. Kong let out a short, bitter laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "They weren't entirely wrong," he muttered. He walked over to the photograph and took it off the wall, holding it with a tenderness that contradicted his reputation. "I spent years trying to erase this version of myself," he said, his voice distant. "I built a kingdom on the ashes of that boy. And now you walk in here, wearing that uniform, and you bring it all back with a single sentence." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers. "You haven't changed much, Elena. You still have that same look in your eyes, like you're waiting for the world to apologize for being so cruel." Elena felt a tear prick at her eye. "I'm not looking for an apology, Minho. I just want to know what happened to my brother." Kong flinched at the word. "We weren't siblings by blood, but in that place, blood was the only thing they couldn't take from us because it was already spilled on the floor." He stepped toward her, his hand reaching out as if to touch her shoulder, but he stopped himself, his fingers curling into a fist. "You cannot stay here," he said, the urgency returning to his tone. "This house is not a place for someone like you. There are people who watch me, people who look for any sign of weakness. If they find out who you are to me, you will become a target. I've spent 20 years making sure no one could hurt me again. I won't let them start with you." Elena shook her head, her resolve hardening despite the fear. "I've spent 20 years being invisible," she said. "I'm not afraid of shadows. I've lived in them my whole life." She looked at the photograph in his hand, then back at the man who had become a monster to survive. "You think you're protecting me by pushing me away, but you're just doing what the matrons did. You're making me a ghost again." Kang's jaw set, a flicker of the old, protective voice shining through the hardened exterior of the Mafia boss. He looked toward the door, his eyes narrowing as he heard the faint sound of a car pulling into the driveway. "That will be the council," he whispered. "They are early." He turned to Elena, his movements sudden and decisive. He grabbed her arm, not with malice, but with a desperate strength, and pulled her toward the heavy oak door of his private study. Inside, he pushed a hidden panel behind a bookshelf, revealing a small, dimly lit room filled with monitors and filing cabinets. "Stay here," he commanded. "Do not make a sound. If I don't come back for you in an hour, there is a keypad by the exit. The code is the date the orphanage burned down." He paused, his hand on the door, looking at her one last time. "I never forgot the kite, Elena. I still have the scar." Before she could respond, he closed the panel, leaving her in the silence of the hidden room. She could hear the muffled sound of voices in the hallway, the cold, sharp tones of men discussing life and death as if they were line items on a ledger. She realized then that her discovery hadn't just changed her life, It had cracked the foundation of the empire Kong had built. The boy from the orphanage was still there, trapped inside a cage of his own making, and for the first time in her life, Elena realized she wasn't the one who needed saving. She sat on the floor, surrounded by the glowing screens of his digital fortress, and waited for the man she once knew to find his way back to the light. The silence inside the hidden room was absolute, a stark contrast to the low, vibrating hum of the monitors that lined the walls. Elena sat on the floor, her back against the cold metal of a filing cabinet, watching the silent flickers of the security feeds. On one screen, she saw the grand foyer she had just been cleaning. 3 men entered, their movements stiff and formal, dressed in suits that cost more than she would earn in a decade. These were the men Kong feared, the council of elders who maintained the delicate balance of the city's underworld. In the center of the frame stood Kong, his posture rigid, his face once again a mask of unreadable stone. He looked nothing like the pale, shaken man who had just whispered about a kite in the rain. He looked like a king defending a crumbling border. Elena watched as they moved into the dining hall, their gestures sharp and accusatory. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see the tension in the way Marcus stood by the door, his hand never straying far from the hem of his jacket. She realized then that Kang's world was a house of cards, held together by the myth of his invulnerability. Her presence, a simple cleaner with a shared past, was a loose thread that could unravel everything. If these men knew that the great Mr. Kong had a heart that still beat for a girl from a forgotten orphanage, they would use it to tear him apart. She gripped her knees to her chest, the light blue fabric of her uniform feeling like a neon sign in the darkness. She was the liability he couldn't afford, yet he had hidden her here, in the heart of his secrets, instead of casting her out into the street. Minutes stretched into an hour, the digital clock on the desk ticking with a rhythmic, taunting precision. Elena's mind raced through the memories they had shared, the taste of stolen apples, the way he would sit by her bed when she had the fever, the day the black cars came to take him away. He had promised to send for her, a promise made with the earnestness of a 10-year-old who didn't understand how the world worked. Now, 20 years later, the debt was being called in. Suddenly, the hidden panel slid open with a soft hiss. Kong stood there, his tie loosened and his eyes bloodshot. "The council is gone," he said, his voice ragged. "But they are suspicious." They heard a rumor that a new staff member was seen speaking out of turn. He stepped into the small room, the space feeling even tighter with his presence. "I have arranged a car for you. It will take you to a safe house across the border. You'll have money, a new identity, a chance to actually live." Elena stood up, brushing the dust from her uniform. "And what about you?" she asked, her voice echoing in the small space. Kong looked at the monitors, at the empty foyer where he spent his lonely nights. "I have to finish what I started," he said. "I can't leave until the debts are settled." Elena stepped closer, reaching out to touch the cold silk of his sleeve. "You're still doing it," she whispered. "You're still trying to be the one who stays behind, so I can run. But I'm not 10 years old anymore, Minho. I don't want a new identity. I want the truth to matter." Kang's gaze softened for a fleeting second, a crack in the armor that he quickly tried to mend. "The truth is a luxury we can't afford," he replied, but his hand moved to cover hers on his arm. His touch was warm, a physical bridge between the children they were and the strangers they had become. Marcus appeared at the entrance of the hidden room, his expression grim. "Sir, the perimeter has been breached. It wasn't the council. It's the splinter group from the docks. They must have followed the elders." Kong didn't flinch. He simply nodded as if he had been expecting this betrayal. "Get her to the garage," he commanded. Marcus hesitated, looking at Elena with a mix of pity and duty. "And you, sir?" Kong pulled a small, silver handgun from his desk drawer, the metal gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "I'll hold the hallway. If they want the throne, they'll have to walk through the fire to get it." Elena felt a surge of cold terror. "No," she cried, grabbing his hand. "You can't stay here alone." But Kong was already moving, his movements fueled by a grim determination. He looked at Marcus, a silent command passing between them. Marcus stepped forward, his large hand gently but firmly taking Elena's arm. "Come with me, ma'am." "He won't leave if you're still in the line of fire." Elena struggled, her eyes locked on Kong as he stepped out into the grand hallway, the boy who had once protected her from bullies now preparing to face a sea of wolves. The descent to the garage was a blur of concrete stairs and muffled shouts from the floors above. Marcus moved with a terrifying efficiency, guiding Elena through the bowels of the mansion. As they reached the armored SUV, the sound of gunfire erupted from the levels above, sharp, rhythmic cracks that shattered the silence of the night. Elena stopped, her hand on the car door. "He's going to die up there, isn't he?" she asked, her voice trembling. Marcus looked at her, his face a mask of professional stoicism, but his eyes betrayed a deep-seated loyalty. "He's the strongest man I've ever known," Marcus said. "But he's been fighting for a ghost for a long time. Maybe now he has something real to fight for." He opened the door for her, but Elena didn't get in. She looked at the elevator, then at the stairs. She remembered the boy who fell from the oak tree, the boy who took a scar for a kite. She realized that for 20 years, he had been building a fortress not to keep people out, but to keep his own heart in. If she left now, she would be fulfilling the cycle of abandonment that had defined both their lives. "I'm not leaving him," she said, her voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. Marcus sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "I figured you'd say that." He handed her a small, heavy object, a burner phone and a set of keys. "If we aren't down in 10 minutes, take the car and drive to the address in the GPS. But if you're staying, stay behind me." They moved back toward the sound of the chaos, the air growing thick with the scent of cordite. When they reached the top of the stairs, the hallway was a battlefield. Two men lay slumped against a mahogany console, and at the end of the corridor, Kong stood behind a marble pillar, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He looked up and saw them, his eyes widening in fury and relief. "I told you to leave," he roared over the sound of a fresh volley of bullets. Elena didn't answer. She simply watched as Marcus joined the fray, his weapon barking in response to the attackers. In the chaos, Elena saw movement near the study. A man she recognized as one of the council's personal guards, raising a rifle toward Kang's exposed side. Without thinking, she grabbed a heavy bronze bust from a pedestal and hurled it with every ounce of strength she had. It struck the man's shoulder, spoiling his aim as the shot went wide, shattering the picture frame on the wall. The photograph of the boy in the orphanage fell to the floor, the glass splintering into 1,000 diamonds. Kong seized the moment, spinning around to neutralize the threat. The silence that followed was heavy and ringing. The attackers were gone or incapacitated, and the mansion felt suddenly, unnervingly empty. Kong walked over to the broken frame, picking up the small, torn photo. He looked at Elena, his face covered in dust and sweat, but for the first time, the paleness was gone. He looked alive. "You saved me," he whispered, the irony not lost on him. Elena walked to him, stepping over the debris of his empire. "We're even for the kite," she said, a small, tired smile touching her lips. Kong looked at the photo, then at the woman standing before him in a stained blue uniform. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, and for the first time in 20 years, the Korean Mafia boss let go of the boy in the picture. The empire was bleeding, the wolves were at the door, but as they walked toward the exit together, the morning sun began to break over the horizon, promising a day where they no longer had to be ghosts.